They thought they were watching you improvise. That was the mistake. They assumed what you were doing was reactive, situational, temporary. They believed you were responding to circumstances the same way they would, adjusting, adapting, figuring things out as you went. That assumption gave them comfort because it placed you inside a familiar frame. Someone experimenting, someone uncertain, someone still forming. What they didn't realize is that you weren't reacting at all. You were executing something internal that never needed their awareness to function. The delay in their understanding wasn't incidental, it was structural. People who live externally cannot recognize internally driven behavior until its effects become unavoidable. Early on, they misread your restraint as hesitation, your silence as lack of clarity, your patience as indecision. That misreading allowed them to relax. It allowed them to underestimate what was unfolding right in front of them. They assumed time was on their side, that eventually you would reveal yourself, explain yourself, or collapse into something legible. You didn't, because what you were doing didn't require validation or interpretation to work. You weren't performing a role. You weren't managing impressions. You weren't seeking alignment. You were building coherence. And coherence doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. While they were busy reacting to surface movement, you were removing friction internally. While they were escalating, you were simplifying. While they were competing for position, you were stabilizing your center. That difference is invisible until it isn't. People only notice strategy when it starts producing outcomes they can't explain. That's when confusion sets in. They start replaying moments they dismissed, conversations they thought were insignificant, choices you made that didn't make sense at the time. In hindsight, patterns begin to form that were never visible from the outside. They realize you weren't scattered. You were selective. You weren't slow. You were timed. You weren't unsure. You were waiting for conditions they couldn't see. This is where the misunderstanding deepened. They thought understanding would come from more information, from explanation, from confrontation. But understanding never arrived that way. It arrived through consequence. Situations began resolving themselves differently around you. Conflicts lost momentum when you were involved. Noise diminished. Decisions simplified. Not because you imposed order, but because you stopped feeding disorder. You didn't correct people. You didn't challenge assumptions. You didn't reveal intent. You let outcomes speak, and outcomes don't argue. The longer this went on, the more unsettling it became for them. Because if what you were doing was intentional, then their early interpretations weren't just wrong, they were irrelevant. That realization is uncomfortable. It forces people to confront how often they confuse visibility with effectiveness and movement with progress. You didn't move the way they expected, so they assumed you weren't moving at all. They didn't realize you were operating beneath the noise layer where real leverage lives. By the time they started asking questions, the process was already irreversible. They weren't late because you hid. They were late because their perception required disruption to update. And disruption doesn't come from announcement. It comes from stability that refuses to collapse. You weren't trying to be understood. You were trying to be precise. Precision doesn't rush. It waits until misunderstanding exhausts itself. And that's exactly what happened. Once they sensed that delay, the realization didn't arrive cleanly. It arrived with resistance. People don't like discovering that something meaningful was happening right in front of them while they were busy interpreting noise. They replayed early moments, searching for mistakes you might have made, looking for proof that what they missed wasn't intentional. But the more they examined the timeline, the clearer it became. You didn't stumble into coherence. You constructed it by refusing to participate in unnecessary reactions, while others escalated to feel relevant. You reduced to become effective. That contrast confused them because reduction looks passive to people, overly dependent on movement. They are trained to equate effort with progress, visibility with control. You disrupted that equation without ever challenging it directly. You simply didn't comply with it. And this is where their confusion became something deeper. Over time, the environment adjusted to your pace instead of the other way around. Conversations slowed when you were present. Decisions stopped being rushed. People hesitated before making assumptions because you never confirmed them. That hesitation was not fear. It was recalibration. They began to realize that every attempt to draw you into urgency failed. Pressure produced no acceleration. Incentives produced no deviation. Emotional influence produced no shift. And when tools stop working, people stop using them. That is when attention sharpens. They notice that your actions landed with finality, while theirs dissolved into revision. You didn't backtrack. You didn't overcorrect. You didn't explain yourself afterward. That meeting where everyone scrambled with 20-minute updates. You spoke once, 2 sentences, and the entire direction changed. Not because you dominated, because you distilled. You allowed outcomes to settle. That unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Confrontation invites response. Silence backed by coherence invites reconsideration. This is where the phrase began forming quietly in their minds. Maybe you weren't unsure. Maybe you weren't delayed. Maybe you were operating on a timeline that didn't require their participation. That thought challenged their framework because it implied you were never competing inside the same structure. You weren't waiting for permission. You weren't accumulating leverage. You were already positioned. Positioned internally. And internal positioning doesn't show itself through motion. It shows itself through inevitability. They noticed how often your presence resolved strain simply by being present, not through mediation, but through removal of excess. You didn't give energy to confusion, so confusion faded. You didn't amplify urgency, so urgency settled. This wasn't strategy in the way they understood strategy. It wasn't coordination or planning or maneuvering. It was alignment. And alignment is invisible to people who rely on friction to feel progress. And that precise alignment is yours alone. By the time they started trying to name what you were doing, it had already done its work. They were observing results, not the process. And results don't reveal their origins to those who weren't paying attention. That is why understanding came late. Not because you were unclear, but because clarity without noise is unreadable to people who have never learned to see it. That late understanding carried a quiet weight they didn't expect. Because once they accepted that what you were doing had been intentional all along, they had to confront something deeper than misinterpretation. They had to confront their own dependence on noise. They realized how often they confuse urgency with importance, reaction with relevance, activity with control. You didn't just move differently, you invalidated shortcuts. They rely on to feel competent, That's why the realization didn't come with clarity at first. It came with discomfort. They sensed that if your way of operating worked without explanation, without visibility, without escalation, then much of what they'd been doing was unnecessary. And unnecessary effort is hard to let go of. So they resisted the conclusion. They told themselves stories. You got lucky. Timing favored you. Circumstances aligned. Anything but the truth. But those explanations kept failing, because luck doesn't repeat cleanly. Timing doesn't hold across environments. Circumstances don't adjust the same way every time, yet outcomes kept aligning around you, not dramatically, reliably. That reliability forced acceptance. They realized you weren't adjusting to systems. Systems were adjusting to you. You weren't disrupting structures. You were exposing which ones depended on reaction to survive. When reaction disappeared, those structures lost relevance. That's when their understanding finally stabilized. Not as admiration, as recalibration. They stopped watching you for signals. They stopped waiting for cues. They stopped assuming you needed to be managed or guided. And what followed that realization was something they didn't expect. They understood, too late but clearly, that what you were really doing was removing yourself from cycles that consume most people. Cycles of proving, cycles of reacting, cycles of seeking validation through motion. You weren't outmaneuvering anyone. You were opting out of the pattern entirely. And once that becomes visible, there's no misunderstanding left to correct. There's nothing to explain. There's only adjustment. They move differently around you now, more carefully, more deliberately. Not because you dominate, but because you don't participate in noise. They finally understand what you were really doing, not hiding, not waiting, not improvising. You were simplifying until only what mattered remained. And by the time they noticed, there was nothing left to interrupt. What followed that realization was not confrontation and not confession. It was restraint. People didn't rush to acknowledge what they missed. They adjusted how they behaved instead. That's always the tell. Words are cheap. Behavior changes only when understanding becomes unavoidable. They stopped interrupting you, stopped over-explaining themselves, stopped trying to guide outcomes around you, not because you demanded space, but because space formed naturally. Once they understood there was no advantage in pressure, they realized that urgency didn't accelerate you, emotion didn't influence you, and authority didn't override you. Every familiar mechanism returned nothing. And when mechanisms stop working, effort becomes inefficient. Efficiency encourages humility. They began noticing how much of their own motion was noise. How often they acted just to feel active. How frequently they escalated just to feel in control. In contrast, your stillness started to feel deliberate instead of passive. Your pauses felt finished, not uncertain. Your silence felt complete, not withheld. That distinction changed how they interpreted everything you did. Even your absence carried weight now, because absence from someone who isn't chasing visibility reads differently. It doesn't suggest loss, it suggests containment. And that containment is your mastery. They started to see that what looked like patience was actually selectivity. What looked like delay was actually precision. You weren't waiting for clarity, you were waiting for irrelevance to wear itself out. And once it did, nothing external could pull you back into it. This is when they understood why you never defended yourself. Defense assumes vulnerability. You didn't feel vulnerable because nothing essential was exposed. You weren't protecting an image. You weren't maintaining a position. You were operating from alignment, and alignment doesn't fracture under pressure. Pressure only reveals where alignment is missing. That's why their behavior changed for the long term. They didn't treat you as someone to be convinced anymore. They treated you as someone to be accounted for. And accounting happens before action, not after. That shift is subtle but lasting. Once someone understands that you're not moving on their timeline, they stop trying to place you on one. Once they realize you're not driven by reaction, they stop trying to trigger one. That understanding didn't arrive because you explained yourself. It arrived because everything they tried fell away quietly. And quiet learning is the kind that teaches fastest. This is where it ends, because once understanding reaches that level, nothing else needs to be revealed. There is no dramatic acknowledgement, no public correction, no moment where they admit they were wrong. People rarely do. Instead, they recalibrate internally and move forward with a different awareness. They stop assuming you need to be managed. They stop expecting you to respond on cue. They stop mistaking your restraint for uncertainty. You become something simpler in their mind and far more difficult to influence. Not mysterious, just resolved. That's the part they didn't see coming. Resolution doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain its logic. It doesn't negotiate. It holds. And holding changes the environment around it. And once that environment shifts completely, something decisive happens. You didn't take longer than expected to reveal what you were doing. You allowed misunderstanding to exhaust itself without interference. You let people project until projection dissolved under its own weight. You let noise run until it lost credibility. And when that happened, what remained was obvious. You weren't improvising. You weren't hiding. You weren't waiting for the right moment to act. You were removing everything that didn't matter so that what did could function without obstruction. That's why they took so long to understand. Because understanding you required releasing habits they were attached to. Habits of reacting. Habits of rushing. Habits of measuring worth through visibility. You didn't confront those habits. You outlasted them. And once they were gone, there was nothing left to misunderstand. They finally saw what you were really doing. Not building advantage. Not accumulating influence. You were simplifying your life until nothing external could move you. And when someone reaches that point, there's nothing left for others to decode. There's only adjustment. And adjustment is the ultimate form of recognition. And once that adjustment completes, the dynamic does not revert. People don't drift back into old assumptions. They don't casually test you again. They don't return to the version of you they once imagined. Accurate perception solidifies into default behavior. From that point on, you exist outside of speculation, outside of interpretation, outside of the need to be figured out, not because you became unreachable, but because there is nothing left to misunderstand. You are no longer processed as potential. You are processed as constant. And constants don't invite debate. They don't require monitoring. They are accounted for and moved around, not questioned. This is why your presence feels different now, even when you say nothing. It's not intensity. It's certainty without display. People sense that nothing they do will accelerate you, slow you, or reroute you. That realization removes urgency from the interaction. And that quiet completion is real. And without urgency, manipulation fades away. With manipulation gone, clarity takes over. You didn't claim that position. You didn't aim for it. You arrived there by subtraction, by releasing unnecessary response, by releasing excess explanation, by releasing the need for external interpretation. When you stopped caring whether people understood you, understanding eventually arrived on its own terms. That's the paradox most never grasp. Clarity cannot be chased. It appears only after performance ends. You didn't prove what you were doing. You let time show what you weren't doing. And in that space, something settled. Not admiration, not fear. Acceptance of limits. They now know where influence ends with you. They know which strategies no longer apply before being tried. They know that whatever framework they're operating within, you're not a participant. And that knowledge shapes behavior more effectively than any declaration ever could. This is why the story doesn't continue. There is no escalation after this, no next misunderstanding to correct, no further reveal waiting to happen. You are already understood at the level that matters, not in words, but in how people move around you. They took longer than expected to understand what you were really doing, because what you were really doing couldn't be seen through reaction. It could only be seen once reaction was no longer present. And when that became clear, there was nothing left to say. The environment adjusted, the noise settled, and you remained exactly where you always were. And that is the final alignment, the point where nothing else needs to be interpreted, clarified, or proven. When understanding reaches this depth, it stops being conscious. It becomes instinctive. People no longer think about you in terms of intent or strategy. They simply account for you the way they account for time or gravity. Not as something dramatic, but as something that cannot be avoided. You are no longer measured by effort or output or explanation. You are measured by effect. And effect doesn't argue with theory. It settles reality. This is why attempts to redefine you no longer appear. Why narratives lose interest. Why speculation fades away. Speculation feeds on uncertainty. There is no uncertainty left. They don't need to agree about you. Agreement already happened at the level of response. Behavior adjusts before words form. That's the signal that the understanding is complete. You didn't win anything. You didn't overcome anyone. You didn't reveal a hidden move at the end. You stepped out of the cycle that requires constant reaction. And when someone exits that cycle, the system doesn't pursue them. It reorganizes around the absence, quietly, naturally. This is why the conclusion now feels settled. Not exciting, not dramatic, just stable. There is nothing left for them to uncover, nothing left for you to demonstrate. The understanding has reached its natural endpoint. You are no longer misunderstood. You are no longer being interpreted. You are simply accounted for. And that is the final stage.